everyone, this is update for December 7, 2024, day 1018, end of the date update. Also catch up since December 2nd, 2024. As you can see, I have update on the US, but I just want to provide quickly economic update on the situation in Europe. And it's actually getting worse, which I would say is not a surprise. And the worst part is that at this point, service part of the economy is falling apart. So far, in the videos I've shown before, there's very clear depression in the manufacturing, which I think is becoming very clear and it's openly discussed on the media and so on. But now the other part, sort of the engine or the second engine of the airplane is falling apart as well. So that's probably going to create very explosive situation in Europe, probably in 6 to 12 months. The more important part that, though it's not just Germany, but it's in continental Europe, 3 countries, Germany, France, and Italy. So Italy quickly joined this club of countries that are losing manufacturing, and then service economy is obviously not working because there's no manufacturing. So this now not just Germany, it's essentially core of Europe, of continental Europe, and also UK is joining the club. They are a little bit behind, so meaning that the decline is not as bad, but heading in the same direction. So as you can see, the situation in Europe is getting worse, and depending on what's going to happen in the US, that's a big question mark right now, because economic policy of the new administration is still unclear. There is a lot of declarations about tariffs and so on, and all sort of, I would say, outlandish economic ideas. But if that's actually true intention, or what's going to happen on the ground, is remain to be seen. One thing is very clear for the US is there is some desire to change the course and implement radical reforms, but there is I have impression that there is understanding that something needs to be done, but then there is no sort of execution plan, no clear vision how to actually implement it, because the problem with the reform is that it will get worse before it gets better. And so if the new administration were to really do reforms, it probably would mean temporary significant recession. Probably not depression, but very difficult economic situation. And that could be very, very difficult in the US, because everything is heavily, everyone, so consumers, corporations, government, everyone is heavily indebted. So that really doesn't leave you room for sort of mistake or for recession. And that's part of the reason why Federal Reserve is doing everything they can to avoid recession, because if recession hits, all of this over-levered entities, or basically entities with too much debt, they're just gonna go bankrupt, and this gonna be, and because there are a lot of them, you can have potentially depression-like situation. And so to do these reforms also means dealing with these entities that are burdened by debt, and that really can basically it can ignite very dangerous chain reaction. And so that's I think the problem was actually attempting to execute this reform, that nobody really knows how to deal with this situation. And I think that's part of the reason there's still no clear plan that's being proposed. There are some rumors, but they are just rumors. You cannot rely much on those on the rumors. But going back to what I was initially saying is that if U.S. Does implement these reforms, deregulation, basically giving more freedom to economic actors, that will worsen European economic situation, pushing essentially Europe into depression, because Europe will become not just not competitive, but extremely not competitive. Um, and that may actually force the change in Europe to do the same. So basically, it's going to be competitive development where Europe essentially will be forced down the road to abandon this war on conventional energy and basically return to sort of normalcy, let's put it this way. But it's probably going to happen through a lot of turmoil in Europe. And all I'm trying to say is that Europe is decisively heading in that direction. Now actually switch to US, just a short update. The main part of this whole system and economic system in general, the whole system that actually underpins the rest of the world as well, is U.S. consumer, and it's still working. That engine is probably the only engine that prevents world from going into severe recession at this point, because as you can see, U.S. Private employment is up. There is quite a bit of jobs were added in large and medium companies, as you can see, 162. But the sort of negative is that small companies stay losing. They actually lost jobs. So this is actually could be, construed as another sign of overregulation in the U.S. economy, where large companies, they are thriving, but small ones, there's too much regulation, too much red tape. They cannot thrive, and they essentially lose jobs and probably also go out of business. And generally the hiring was pretty much across the board. The only exception is actually manufacturing, which is consistent theme in the U.S. losing manufacturing jobs. It's hard for me to say what really truly driving it, but there is some probably fundamental factor that's driving it. Probably also too much regulation. It's hard to actually pinpoint something specific, because energy is cheaper in the US than, let's say, in Europe. So even just from that perspective, US should be more competitive. Labor is definitely expensive, but at the same time, there's quite a bit of automation that's possible these days. So again, very unclear. There's something, and I very upfront, I don't know what drives the situation in the U.S. Manufacturing, but it's very clearly, call it dying. And then actually we can look at the. I just want to show how the role of manufacturing within the private economy. So the total number of employed in the private economy in the U.S. is roughly we can say 133 million people. Out of that, manufacturing is only 12.7 million. We can say 13 million. So essentially, manufacturing is a very, very small fraction of the U.S. Economy. And actually, if we look at what sort of one of the biggest employers is actually trade, transportation, utilities, which is roughly 29 million. So what this, in simple terms, what this really means is that this is essentially a system for distribution of foreign imported goods. That's what the retail trade, basically retail trade, and all of the supply chain that's related to distribution of, let's say, imported goods from around the world. And you can see how oversized that relative to actual manufacturing. So the whole, that's the reason. What I'm trying to say is this is not typical, not normal situation where you would have more manufacturing, smaller retail sector, and sort of logistics. but it's actually inverse in the US. And then another one is education and health services. This is, another problem area in the US, even just because the number is big, but the quality of the education and health services are not great. And I think I actually saw the reason for that is for this Doge. They posted a chart that showed actually explained the reason for the problem, and how sort of outside overgrown this sector that's completely showing just basically inefficiency. And the reason for that is that in the US there's too many administrators per, let's say, doctor or per actual teacher. So don't recall the exact number, but it was like 1 to 10. So you'd have like 10 administrator and only one teacher, or 10 administrator and one doctor. And essentially there's no growth in number of teachers or doctors. So actually people who perform, who basically produce in a service terms, obviously. So it's all basically bureaucracy that's essentially drag on productivity and increase of the cost. And so again, this is another sort of problem area, as you can see in the US. And then professional business services, this is white collar jobs in the US, where relatively high paid jobs. And then as you can see, then immediately after that it goes leisure and hospitality. That's low quality, low paying jobs, and it's pretty big number. Then financial services, which is again white collar jobs, relatively well paying jobs. And then construction is kind of a middle ground. But the other interesting part is that information is actually not that big part of the economy. US is kind of like known for IT, technology, and so on. But it actually, if you look at the number of people employed in that sector, it's actually pretty small relative to the entire sort of private working population. Also, there's also update for service sector, which again, that's what we were talking about. And there are two metrics, and they actually interestingly show contradictory results. So one, which is by S&P, it shows actually expansion and accelerating expansion to 56.1. Just a refresher for those who knew. Above 50 means expansion, below 50 means a contraction. So this one shows service is doing well, and it's consistent with employment moving along essentially in the US. But there's a sort of contradictory number from ISM. That's I think it's like Institute for Supply Management, so basically alternative competitive organization. And they actually show quite a bit of nosedive from 56 to 52. Again, it's possible that the change is happening and there is something going on that may affect service in the US, but it's really too early to tell anything about that. That's all for sort of macroeconomic update. Now I'm gonna switch. Oh, and then another important part, sorry, I forgot to mention, is US debt. As you can see, it's growing very quick. So I just looked up, how much debt US added since it passed 36 trillion. Oh, sorry, how much time it took to get to this amount. Since US passed 36 trillion. So basically, on what date we were at 36 trillion, and now we're obviously December 7, we are at 36 trillion and 167 billion. So like how quickly we basically added 167 billion. And so it's actually pretty alarming. Just in 15 days, so November 21st, when US had passed 36 trillion, and just in 15 days it added 167 billion in debt. That's I would say totally unsustainable. It's roughly at the clip of 300 billion per month, and I think prior months, October, I think US added, if I recall correctly, like 200 billion. So that situation is clearly um, is definitely what can stop this whole employment situation and sort of in this whole consumer economy, and will stop the consumption, the U.S. consumption that drives the rest of the world, and that's why this number is extremely important. Now, like, I'm just gonna provide quick update on situation in Syria. So, Assad regime ceased to exist. There are news that he fled the country. Nobody knows where. Probably to Russia. And it's a huge loss for Russia and Iran. Um, there were thoughts that Russia may just keep this bridgehead in Latakia in Syria because they have their military bases, installation, and so on. But it appears that Russia is evacuating completely its military forces and not gonna hold its military bases in Syria. So basically, Russia lost all of its military assets and influence in the Near East, essentially. Again, it's a huge strategic loss for both Iran and Russia, because Russia invested a lot of human lives, military equipment, money in supporting Assad regime, and it fell anyways because it's due to its internal mismanagement of the country. Actually, too much bureaucracy, basically disempowering people. It leads to this in the end. Even Russia and Iran couldn't help and couldn't save. And Russia could not help for very simple reason: does not have resources. Everything is tied up in Ukraine, so they could not send any sort of boots on the ground. Russia was using airplanes, but without infantry, they're useless. So, which again goes back to the sort of ages old known truth that infantry is really the key of any military force. Without infantry, nothing else matters. Let's put it this way. And Iran is also was blocked and couldn't help, and Hezbollah is severely, let's say, lost significantly its potency due to Israel attacks against Hezbollah. So they also, obviously cannot help. So this obviously will change strategic situation in the Near East, and it remains to be seen how it's going to be played out. One thing is very clear: is that Turkey is de facto controlling most of the country, because all of these groups that came to power, they are really pro-Turkish, but doesn't mean that they're not going to change their tune once they solidify the power. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen in Syria. Now let's switch to the situation on the battlefield in Ukraine. And general update. So Ukrainian government released a new number on dead and missing in action, and the total number 105,000 people. So 70,000 dead and 35,000 missing in action, which really means dead, and basically just nobody knows where, like, how and where they died. I would say that this number is clearly underestimating actual number of dead and missing in action, which I would say, and it's always a speculative number. Nobody knows for sure, except obviously the Ukrainian government, but it's probably closer to 200,000 people, if not more. But it's certainly not like this numbers like 400,000 or 500,000 people dead and so on. That's obviously For the most part, I would say Russian propaganda. More realistic numbers, somewhere closer to 200,000 people, plus minus, probably a little bit more towards plus side. So now I'm gonna do a walkthrough in a clockwise fashion, the way I always do it, starting from very north. As a general situation, things are developing in very negative direction for Ukrainian forces, for Ukrainian defense, mostly in this central Donbass area, and I'll discuss in detail once we get there. But first, let's jump into Kursk region. Things here also developing in negative direction for Ukraine. So Ukrainian forces are losing these villages here that I'm showing, Plekhovo, Huyevo. So essentially, soon it will be very small piece of Russian territory that Ukrainian forces control. Now let's move to the situation north and northeast of Kharkiv. Things more or less stable. Russian troops keep their buffers there, but no major movements on either side. And as you can see, this is actually happening since June 27th. So this been probably 6 months or more than of this situation. Now let's look at the situation on the North Lugansk front line. Things here more or less stable, strong Russian attacks, but no major territorial losses by Ukrainian forces. So small losses always happening. So this is just a sort of norm at this point, but so far no major losses. Now let's look at the situation on the North Donbass front line. The northern sector remains more or less stable. Things relatively okay for Ukraine here. The situation in the southern part is slowly but surely developing in a negative direction for Ukraine. I mentioned about this fight for this brick manufacturing facility, and that fight sort of moving in a favorable for Russia direction. Let's put it this way. It's not sort of done deal, but it seems that it's moving. That Russian forces will control that factory, which at that point that they will control Chasiv Yar, and essentially the front line will collapse. And as I stated, Ukraine will lose most of this territory that I'm showing in with the pointer. Now let's move south to central Donbass front line, where things really getting, I would say, really bad for Ukraine. So Russian troops managed to, I would say, break through south of Pokrovsk. As you can see, they captured this village Novotroyitske. They captured the village here, Shevchenko. So essentially, they are on outskirts of Pokrovsk at this point. Also, this road that I'm showing, one of the main roads from Pokrovsk to the west, is essentially not usable because Russian troops control it through the drone attacks, UAV attacks, and so on. So it's essentially not usable, as I stated. And there is only this E50, which goes straight to Dnipro. That's still usable, but it's also getting under attacks more frequently. So really what this means is that defense of Pokrovsk is becoming more and more difficult, and it's almost like slowly losing oxygen. That will eventually will lead to loss of Pokrovsk. At this point, this seems to be a done deal. It's not going to be quick, probably, but judging by how quickly things develop in a negative direction, I might be overly optimistic. Let's put it this way. But again, situation is developing very quickly into very negative territory, and I want to almost draw analogy with situation in Syria, where Syrian or Assad regime army quickly collapsed, and Ukraine obviously not in that state, but it's certainly, unfortunately, heading in that direction. And that's why we see this huge advances and fairly quick advances, and I would say at accelerating speed advances by the Russian army. And it's not a problem of weapons or lack of weapons, and it's not problem of lack of soldiers. It's a problem of much more difficult, much more important problem is that people don't know what they're fighting for, because whatever Ukrainian president created in the country is not something not society that people want to support, and that doesn't mean anything about Russia. It really means there's overreaching bureaucracy that control everything, that essentially essentially suffocates economically most people, and they just don't see a future. They don't want to support system like that, and that's really in very, let's say, simple but extremely correct explanation what's happening. And that's why this ideas of like, okay, let's just send more weapons, or let's just draft 18-year-olds, they both wrong solutions. They are actually typical solution of Western bureaucrats. So in some ways, the problem actually for Ukraine is that Ukraine president basically supported and directed by the Western bureaucracy, which itself is destructive to the West, and not sort of Western entrepreneurial or sort of like private actors. And that's in some ways at the core of why Ukraine is losing the war so far. And just want to draw parallels. So why is it why is it working for Russia? Because Russia is extremely bureaucratic country. Simply at this point, that they just better at bureaucracy. And Ukraine was never good at bureaucracy. It's not sort of Ukraine's DNA. And so Ukraine in some ways tries to play Russia in the sort of area where Russia is naturally strong, because of the Russian bureaucracy existed for probably, I don't know, 600, 700 years. It's heavily embedded in population, in a culturally embedded. And so attempting to basically replicate, it's in some ways, this is why Ukraine is actually at war, and obviously Ukraine was invaded by Russia, but the biggest reason why Russia invaded Ukraine is, if we just look this, Ukraine and Russian without taking into account West and so on, is that Ukraine is opposite of Russian bureaucracy. So it's more free, it's more independent, it's more individualistic, and that really doesn't jive with Russia with culturally, and that's really the root cause of the conflict. If you look at it just from a perspective of Russia and Ukraine, and let's say remove everything else. But this conflict is obviously much more complex than just Ukraine and Russia. But that segment, that's the explanation that I gave, is probably the best explanation. Then I'm going to move a little bit south. Russian troops captured most of Kurakhove. The only part that controlled by Ukrainian troops is this power plant, basically industrial zone. At the same time, it's pretty good defensive position. The only problem is that Russian troops approach too close to this road that goes west from Kurakhove, and essentially also cutting oxygen for defensive for Ukrainian forces that are west of this village Dachne. So for that reason, Ukrainian forces probably going to lose this whole area and in a quick fashion, and also this advance also means that this whole area is essentially doomed as well. And probably Russian troops will try to clear out this whole zone before they will try to they will attempt to capture Pokrovsk. Now let's actually, this is more specific maps that I just want to show. This is that road that I mentioned that it's essentially cut off and become unusable, and this is Russian sort of breaks through where they captured this Novotroyitske and Shevchenko, and almost captured Zaporizhzhia. And I just want to show you a few days before how quickly this negative development is happening. So this was December 2nd. You see this was still essentially under Ukrainian control, and basically in 5 days there's a quick advance by Russian troops, which again shows that simply it's not because Russian troops are better or actually not even outnumbering Ukrainian troops. That's not the case. It's just because Ukrainian soldiers, regular soldiers, they just don't want to fight, and that's really the answer for this question, for this problem that Ukraine is facing. And this is if we go to 28th, so you can see that even sort of more clear this whole advance, this whole area, and then also south of Zhovte, Pushkina. So you can see that the front line really not holding and falling apart at accelerating speed, I would say. This is a situation around Kurakhove. So as I mentioned, Russian troops essentially approaching to this road, going west from Kurakhove, closer to village Dachne, and essentially this road barely usable, essentially unusable. So you have just field roads, and obviously you cannot sort of live long on that. Not to mention that Russian troops are attempting to move north of this village Sukhi Yaly, which they captured. So, which again, as you can see, this is the same kind of pincer movement, same encirclement that essentially typical strategy or tactical and strategic approach of Russian command. And we can see the same thing here as well at a sort of extremely micro scale around Uspenivka. So Ukrainian forces are still a little bit sort of west of Uspenivka, and essentially at this point they almost encircled because Russian troops are on the northern outskirts of Uspenivka and just right south of Uspenivka. So this could be potentially small pocket. Probably Ukrainian forces will manage to escape, but it's very clear this escape will be expensive for Ukrainian forces there. There's actually little positive development for Ukraine, and that Ukrainian forces managed to counterattack and liberate this village Novy Kamar, which I mentioned that was captured by Russian troops on December 2nd. Now they managed sort of a little bit stabilized situation. Doesn't mean that things are sort of it's not a turnaround by any means. It's just a small reprieve. And I just want to show you, this is from this December 2nd. I mentioned that Russian troops managed to capture this Novy Kamar and actually even be on the north outskirts of Velika Novosilka. So it was absolutely critical situation. And Ukrainian troops managed to actually push Russian forces back, essentially back behind this road that goes up north. Now let's just move next to the Zaporizhzhia front line, where things more or less stable. not much is going on there. Let's finish with the front line along the Dnipro River, and where things are also quiet, nothing is going on here. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Till next time. Bye bye.